Now that we explored try-catch, I want to dive into a totally different yet slightly related concept. I want to talk about scoping of variables, constants, and functions. Now, what's scoping? Scoping simply means that variables, constants, and functions can only be used in certain places. Now, for example, if I create a read file function in errors.js, I can only use it in that file unless I export it with module exports. Then we can export an object and export our read file function like this if we want to. That's what you saw before in the course already. This is only the case in Node.js though. In browser-side JavaScript, you can't use this module exports feature, but there you also don't need to, because in browser-side JavaScript, if you simply have a couple of script tags in your HTML file that import different JavaScript files, the variables and functions defined in those files will be accessible in other files automatically. So that file-based scoping, locking in values into a file, is exclusive to Node.js. But we also have different forms of scoping that apply to both the browser and Node.js. And the most important aspect here, or the most important thing to note about scoping here, is that constants and functions and variables are only available in the block where you defined them. Now, what's a block? A block in JavaScript is simply a section of code that's wrapped by curly braces, with the exception of the creation of an object. If you use curly braces on the right side of an equal sign to create an object, then in here we don't have a block of code. Instead, here we're using curly braces to create an object. In all other places in the code, like here when we define a function, or if we try and catch, or if we have a for loop, whenever we have curly braces here, these curly braces mark a block of code. A block of code that belongs to the loop, a block of code that belongs to this function, or a block of code that belongs to try or catch. And if I define a constant here in this block here, for example, it's only available in this block. I can't console log file data here outside of the try block. If I try to do that, and I then execute this errors.json file, I get an error that file data is not defined. Because here in line 9, file data is totally unknown. The constant file data, which I create in the try block, is only available inside of that try block. So console logging it here would work if we wouldn't fail to read from the file system. Console logging it here fails. If we want to access file data in both the try block and in this line, we instead have to create a variable file data in the function block, in which both the try block and line 10 are. And then instead of creating a new constant of that same name, we simply assign file data here in try. Because that's also important. When I say that variables, constants, and functions are only available in the block in which they are defined, that also means that they are available in any nested blocks. So here, file data is defined in the read file function block. That also makes it available inside of the try block though, since the try block here is inside of that function block. So from outside to inside is supported, the other way around isn't. And this concept, which is called block scoping, is important to understand. It is important to understand that your constants and variables are only available inside of the block where you define them, not outside of that block. Now, directly related to this idea of scoping variables and constants, We also have the concept of shadowing variables or constants. And you can see that here, if I actually re-add const in front of file data in line 6. Now, file data already is a variable defined in line 4. And now instead of assigning to that existing variable, I am creating a brand new constant. Now, what will happen if we now try to execute this file? Let's give it a try. If I execute this, everything works, but please note that we get undefined here. And that's coming from line 10, actually. Now we're getting undefined here because file data in line 10 is actually referring to this variable, file data, because they are in the same block of code. File data defined here, this constant file data which we are assigning in line 6, is not the file data we are referring to here, because file data here in line 6 is in a different block, in that try block. Now that's why we get undefined here when we try to refer to file data. It's simply referring to a different file data which hasn't received a value. But why aren't we getting an error if we try to redefine a variable or constant that already exists? Typically that's not possible. For example, I wouldn't be allowed to add a constant file data in the very next line after defining that variable with the same name. Well, that's again related to scoping. If you do create variables or constants with clashing names in different scopes, that's allowed. Here in try, in a scope that's part of this overall read file function scope, I can create a new constant, and if that constant has the name of a variable or constant of the outer scope, that is allowed, and we simply shadow that outer variable or constant. That means we can use the outer variable or constant if we want to, like in this case when I assign a value to it. But we can also create a different constant or variable of the same name, which will then have a higher priority inside of that inner block. So then we simply have a second constant which is totally unrelated to this other variable or constant with the same name. This is something you can do. It's also not uncommon to do that, though if you find something like that to be confusing, you can of course always go for different names to make it clearer which variable or constant belongs to which scope. Now here I will remove const again, but being aware of this shadowing concept and that you can have clashing names is something that you should keep in mind. But that's already all you need to know about this feature.